So I actually kind of forgot that Kill Your Darlings existed until I watched Saltburn. God, was it a couple of years ago now? Nearly. And I remember that this was such an influential film that I loved so much in my youth, and I decided to watch it again. I remembered it as this big, epic love story, and I wanted to see if it held up in that regard. Because you know, things change, your perspective changes from when you're a teenager, and sometimes you don't love the things that you used to love as much, so I wanted to test the theory. The events of Kill Your Darlings are obviously based on a real life murder that is said to be the catalyst of the beat lit movement. I'm going to refrain from talking about the actual murder until the end and talk about the film as its own entity first, because that is how I first experienced it. The basic plot of the movie centers around Allen Ginsberg, who starts at college. He falls in love with a beautiful boy named Lucien Carr, who he later finds out is involved with this stalky, troublesome older man named David. They start this poetic movement together, they kiss once, and then Lucien tries to run away before ending up in this dramatic confrontation with David that ends with Lucien killing him. Lucien tells the world it was an honor slaying, he kind of gets away with it, and as a result, he can never come out and be his true self and be gay with Alan. And the two of them kind of, it's implied that they don't speak again after that, right? All very tragic and romantic. It's exactly the kind of love story that I have always loved, because I've got this weird thing where I'm so invested in stories where they can't be together at the end. I find that the most romantic, and especially when they've had limited time to actually be together. Like maybe most of the story focuses on the build up to their relationship. They get one night together or even just one kiss, like in Kill Your Darlings, and then they're ripped apart by fate forever. I don't know why I like that so much. I don't know why I like to torture myself like this, but this is the person that I am. I love the academia aesthetics of the film. I think it's shot great. I think that there's a lot of quirky and pretentious quotes in there, which is something that I love. I'm thinking when Alan first shows up in Lucian's room and he says, finally, an oasis in this wasteland. I absolutely love that. First thought, best thought is something that I often say that's from this movie. And when Lucien kisses the girl at the party at David's and says he doesn't want to know her because she tastes like imported sophistication and domestic cigarettes. The biggest draw for me in this film is and always has been the character of Lucien Carr as this manic pixie dream boy, this unknowable mythical figure within the film and even in real life. There's this tragedy about him because he is the muse and the inspiration for this movement and for all these beautiful words, but he never got to write any poems for himself and to speak his truth because of this awful thing that happened to him that was kind of no fault of his own. And we'll get into that. So, a massive, massive theme of the film is that life is round. It's the first thing that Lucien says to Alan when he comes to his room, basically, after the whole Oasis thing. Basically, that life is a circle and that we keep coming back to the same events over and over again, but maybe with different contexts. I think we can all acknowledge that life is a repeating pattern for a lot of people, and so the life is round analogy is true for a lot of people. It's certainly a philosophy that I took into my life and internalized without even really realizing that this film inspired it so much. So if life is round, then it only makes sense that the beginning of the film is also the end. We begin with the murder and the words of Alan's story that he will end up writing about the murder, about how some things in life, once you've loved them, they become yours and they circle back to you no matter what you try to do to separate yourself from them, which also, links into the theme of life is round. We're going to come back to this circles theme a lot over the course of this, so just be prepared for that. I'm going to hammer it in. At the beginning of the film, Alan is obviously drawn into this circle of friends and also into this cycle of abuse between Lucien and David. But when he first starts college, he doesn't know that yet. There's also this idea of breaking the circle. I don't think the circle can ever be truly broken because every time it is, it just starts at the beginning again, okay? It's the Ouroboros, the Aurora Borealis. But a breaking of the circle could be seen as like the movement in the fact that they had these new rules for writing and they inspired this new era. And also in context of the movie itself, the murder can be seen as breaking the circle because this cycle of abuse between David and Lucien has been going on for a while, and it finally starts this new chapter in life for Lucien, even if the chapter isn't necessarily a better one. The film has this really interesting way of having beautiful and terrible things happen at the same time, which is, again, another stark fact of life that we can all accept, right? While somebody can be having the worst time of their life in the corner of a party, somebody else can be falling in love in the other corner, okay? So the movement is being inspired and being thought up by these guys in college while a war is going on and people are dying. Horrible things are happening to people all over the country, but Alan is here at college falling in love, learning about himself, doing this whole self-discovery journey. So Alan goes to college and it's all very boring until we're introduced to Lucien Carr, who's played by Dane DeHaan, which is probably a big factor in why I fell so in love with him when I was a teenager. Man is a fairy, a painting. His intro is actually a clever little bit of foreshadowing, and obviously foreshadowing as like a means to predict the future in a film also very easily fits into this circles theme that we have going here. So the foreshadowing in this scene is that Lucien gets in a little bit of trouble in the library and some of the staff start chasing after him, and as he's exiting he yells, "Alert the press, tell them that Lucien Carr is innocent." And that's foreshadowing for the fact that he's going to commit murder at the end, and he's going to have to protest his innocence once more in a much more serious context. So Lucien's circle is already kind of clear to us here in the fact that he's a troublemaker and he works outside of the law. And that circle, it's only going to get like tighter and tighter for him, right, until he gets himself in some big trouble. So Lucien is actually the one to introduce Alan to David. He takes him to a party at David's house. It seems to be kind of a very social place where there's always people around. It introduces us a bit more to the complexity of Lucien's character. Lucien's character is a big, big part of the narrative. His mystique is kind of what the entire film hinges on. For me, I guess. At first we might think that he and David are friends, but as the narrative goes on, we come to realize that he actually kind of hates David. And obviously they have this complicated, tumultuous past relationship. So it's weird, right, that he would be the one to turn up there since he seems to spend the rest of the movie trying to avoid David. So then you're left to wonder, oh, did he bring Alan as his new little thing on the side to make David jealous? Did he secretly want to see David and just use Alan as an excuse? I like that Lucien's character is very mysterious. I like that he can be read a lot of different ways. The backstory with Lucien and David as far as the film goes is that David has known Lucien since he was a little bit younger, and he's kind of low-key obsessed with him. In fact, high-key obsessed with him. He pursues him romantically, and possibly something happened between them in the past, but the details are murky. Lucien really seems to hate David and want to be rid of him, but there's also this part of him that seems reliant on him. Lucien doesn't have a lot of confidence in his own writing, it seems, and so David is writing his essays for him to get by at school, especially because he keeps getting kicked out of places. He's like a troubled child, right? Lucien's father also left him when he was quite young, and we see that that's affected him quite a lot, and so David was probably the first father figure that Lucien had in his life, and he's basically taken advantage of that relationship, and it's very, very inappropriate to say the least, and very non-safe to say the most. You can imagine that as a younger boy, Lucien might have been kind of flattered by the attention of this older guy, and now as he's getting older he's realizing that this relationship is not appropriate or fucking sane, and he wants out. But at the same time he's so entangled in it now, and David follows him everywhere. Maybe he just feels like he can't escape. There's this really great scene where Alan and Lucien are pretending they're about to be hanged so that they can make a big dramatic speech. Something goes wrong and they end up almost accidentally hanging themselves before the beam that they've done it from ends up snapping. It's this scene that really makes you laugh, that is contrasted by a scene much later in the film when Lucien is in jail and he attempts to hang himself again in his cell, and it doesn't work. Again, it's that theme of circles, guys. We circle back to this same scenario of Lucien being hanged, but they're framed in a completely different way. So he's basically at opposite ends of the circle here. We actually find out when Alan is doing some investigating into Lucien's past that he has attempted before, and so Lucien's in this circle of like self-destructive behavior. It actually turns out that David is the one who rescued Lucien from this previous suicide attempt, and so we can see how he would feel indebted to David in that way, and so it's even harder for him to escape from this relationship that he has with David. On a lighter note, all the drug scenes are really fun. I like the one where they're in the jazz bar and time slows down. I really like the music that they use in that scene. I like the music in the film overall. Jazz is really heavy inspiration for a lot of it. Lucien actually starts to get a little bit disenfranchised with Alan. He's not sure that Alan has like the chutzpah to write the poetry that he needs for this big movement he wants to start. And so he goes out and he recruits Jack Kerouac. You know, the Jack Kerouac, no big deal. Alan hijacks his date with Jack and they end up stealing a boat. He's really pissy and he ends up reading out his poem that he finally wrote for Lucien right before he went out. and cheated on him with Jack, essentially. Everybody's really taken aback by Alan's beautiful words, obviously, and there's this really lovely moment where Lucien looks up at him, stood up in this boat, and he says, "You wrote that?" And Alan looks down at him and he says, "You asked me to." And I think it's lovely. It's really indicative of how Alan feels about Lucien in that moment. Like, he's in love with the boy and he would do anything for him. And I think that's precious and that's sweet in this moment, okay? After the boat scene is when everything starts going to shit. Lucien's mum turns up and we find out all about him getting kicked out of his previous schools, about the fact that David's essentially a predator who's been following him. Lucien has this big anger outburst and he tells Alan that he's leaving, even though Alan's just, unbeknownst to Lucien, taken the fall for stealing the boat and gotten Lucien out of trouble. It's a really interesting scene because it shows Alan that while for him this has all been him breaking out of his comfort zone, falling in love and having adventures, for Lucien it's just been more of the same self-destructive behaviour that he's always engaged in. They're having exactly the same experience, but they're at opposite ends of the circle feelings wise. It's almost like, if you know anything about Greek mythology, it's like the wheel of fortune. Sometimes you're at the top and sometimes you're at the bottom, but you're always on the wheel forever. There's this heartbreaking line from Lucien where he says, "Now you know the truth about me. I'm only good at beginnings." It's heartbreaking just as a statement from a character anyway, thinking that they're not good at finishing anything, friendships, just general life stuff. But especially for this character, for Lucien Carr, who we know inspired the beginning of this movement and then never went on to write any poetry for himself. I just think whoever came up with that line is a bitch. I absolutely love the scene where they're trying to get the keys for the library to do a big heist, where they swap out the display books with dirty pictures. Jack is meant to seduce the girl behind the desk, but then he accidentally seduces one of the girls that's about to get off her shift. And so a new girl comes in and Alan says he's going to go in there because he wants to impress Lou, right? Alan, played by Daniel Radcliffe, brilliantly, by the way. I absolutely love his geeky charm in this. It's so awkward, but I absolutely love it. He like goes over and he says, "I want to take out a book." And she's like, "Okay, what's the book called?" And he's like, "It's called The Day Amanda Came," because that's her name's Amanda on the name tag, and it's just ridiculous. And the reason I even mention any of this really is because I can't let this review go by without mentioning the infamous blowjob scene where Amanda is giving Alan head and Lucien comes in to steal the keys and they make searing fucking eye contact with each other and until Alan climaxes, basically. This, I am sure, was a sexual awakening for many young women at the time. At this point, it is still kind of ambiguous whether Lucien is even interested in other men. And then they go and throw a scene like this at us, and it's like, well, the narrative seems to be trying to spin it one particular way. They pull off their library heist in a fantastic and intense scene with great music, and then they get spectacularly drunk, and Lucien and Alan have a lovely moment together on top of a hill. Basically, they're both saying how happy they are, and Lucien turns to Alan and he says, "It's your fault, Kinsey, it's all your fault." It's a lovely, lovely scene where we see Alan feeling appreciated by Lou and feeling like he's made him briefly happy in his tumultuous state of life. And it also mirrors a scene earlier in the film. I haven't mentioned Alan's mum yet, but basically she has a lot of mental health issues, and as soon as he went away to college, his dad basically shipped her off to a mental asylum from Alan's point of view and replaced her with another woman. He turned up the day that she was getting shipped off and she looked at him in the eyes and said, "This is your fault." And that was a horrible, horrible thing. But here we are with somebody saying exactly the same thing to him, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. We are at the opposite end of the circle. They ran into David at the bar earlier, and the gang kind of encouraged Lucien to finally cut him off, and Lucien stands up to him. We see in this moment that Lucien does have some power over David. Like, David just goes completely pathetic for him. But it's in the same way I would say that fucking Dolores Hayes has any power over Humbert, right? It's not real power, but because Alan kind of sees them all as equals at this point, and he doesn't know the backstory, all he sees is that Lucien is the one with the power. And so from Alan's point of view, maybe Lou is this manipulative, horrible person. And I say that because he and Lucien actually end up sharing a kiss on this night. It's the only kiss that they will ever share, according to the film lore. And immediately after this, Lucien turns cold on Alan, right? And he sends him home and he says, "Well, you're going to have to start writing my essays for me," basically, because now David isn't going to, because I've cut him off. It's after this that Lucien decides to basically run away with Jack and become a merchant seaman. And it's to escape David, but we also kind of get the feeling that he's running away from Alan. But we don't know if he's running away from Alan in a I'm running away from my feelings in a dramatic gay way, or if it's a I'm running away from you because I'm not actually gay and I don't know how to tell you, and this whole situation is reminding me of the traumatic experience I've already had with this other gay man who was an actual predator. It's very complicated to talk about this, obviously, and it's probably not very polite to speculate on somebody's sexuality, but it's a big question of the narrative, right? Whether he's interested in men, essentially. I think the narrative does a fairly good job of keeping Lucien ambiguous in this respect, but unfortunately, as a result, I think they kind of made him look like a dick, and I don't know how intentional this was. I think, in all honesty, they didn't dive deep enough into the backstory with David. Lucien spends the night at Jack's and David turns up at the window. You can really see by the way that David acts that he thinks that this is a love story, right? He's going full Joe Goldberg on Lucien's ass. He's turning up here thinking it's going to be this big romantic gesture and that he and Lou are going to clinch together and it's all going to be perfect from now on. Lucien basically tells him to bugger off, but he leaves the window open, which is interesting. You could see this as like him being a tease, him being a flirt, being like, I'm going to leave the window open just in case you want to come in. But I think that I like it. I like these elements that don't make Lucien the perfect victim. Because who is? Who would know what to do in this situation? Do you know what you would do in this situation? It is important to note that the film does compare Alan with David a lot. And I don't know whether this is favourable or unfavourable as far as the messaging of the film goes. When they first meet, David says something about Alan saw Lucien in the lunch line and now he's all that you can see, or something like that. Alan makes a comment about how would you know, or something, and Will, their friend, says that David is in the same goddamn line. The two are compared from the beginning, but I think that because the film is framed through Alan's point of view, you kind of, on first viewing, read them as romantic rivals, more than what I think I've come to view them as, which is kind of the villains of the story. I mean, David's definitely the villain of the story, but Alan, it's a little more murky. I don't think he's like an all-out bad guy as far as the story goes, but I just think that his relationship with Lucien was more in his head than he would like to believe, and then you might actually get a read on the first time you watch the film. I actually think that the film is quite deep, bro. So then we get to what I like to call the penetration montage. This is the big, like, climax, I would say, of the theme of circles and beautiful and terrible things happening at the same time, right? Because Alan fucks Lucien off. He's feeling really upset with him because he finds out that he's setting off to sea, and he goes out and he has gay sex for the first time, starting his life of having gay sex. And, you know, his journey of self-discovery is complete in that way. Also, he's, like, broken the circle of his relationship with Lucien by kind of moving on to somebody else. Like, he's gotten over Lucien by getting under someone else, basically. Their friend Will, who is William S. Burroughs, also famous, very famous for doing a lot of drugs. He does heroin for the first time in the penetration montage, starting his long cyclic relationship with the drug. Jack is listening to a message from his friend who's got some shrapnel in him and is going to die in the war. And our boy Lucien Carr is stabbing David, his pursuer, his abuser. He's killing him. And he's ending that cycle of abuse, but he's starting a new one for himself because obviously he's going to go on to be a fucked up human because of this. He hasn't been able to live a normal life until now, and that's not going to suddenly stop just because David isn't around anymore. The psychological consequences have already been dealt. It is interesting that they keep the Boy Scout knife detail, I'm pretty sure, because David, I know I said I wasn't going to mention real life, but I can't help myself. David was actually his Boy Scout leader in real life. He knew Lucien from when he was very, very young. It was a very, very horrible relationship, I can only imagine. And that's an instance of like the real life case also tying into this theme of life being round, because that's how he was introduced to David and that's how he made David gone from his life. Alan goes to see Lucien in jail after he turns himself in, and Lucien asks him to write his plea, essentially saying that he killed David in an honor slaying. It's this old thing. I'm like so sure that they don't have this anymore, where if you're a straight guy and a gay guy comes onto you and you like feel like you can't get away, then you're justified by this law to kill him to get away, right? And as long as you can prove that you are in fact straight, then you're good to go. In the film, this is kind of framed as a betrayal from Lucien, not only to his relationship with Alan, but as like a betrayal also of his true self and his gayness, right? But when he's presented with the story that Alan writes, which is actually one where he says he thinks Lucien was in love with David. He couldn't handle the guilt of being gay, essentially, in the world that they lived in. As a result, all of this pressure built up between them, and he ended up killing David. Lucien sees this and he's immediately like, this is your truth, this is fiction. And I think that's such an important line in the film where the framing is off, but that's because it's Alan's point of view. Yes, Alan feels like this is a betrayal, but what has there really been between him and Lucien up until this point? One kiss that he initiated when they were pissed. He hasn't known Lucien for that long, and it's entirely possible that he's misread the signals, and so have we, because by all cliches of the genre, surely these two are meant to be falling in love right now, right? Okay, so I'm currently on the edit, and I think that I've just not done a good enough job here of not displaying Lucien Carr as a villain, and I feel like I just wanted to jump in really quick and give a little bit of real world context that I think will help you understand. First of all, even within the context of the film, you have to understand that Lucien isn't actually saying that an honor slaying is what went down here, okay? Lucien didn't kill David just because he was gay and Lucien didn't want his advances, okay? He killed him because he felt threatened by him. He was this predator who had stalked him throughout his entire life, okay? But Lucien doesn't feel like the law is going to care about those circumstances, and so he's using the honor slaying law just as a means to an end to get himself out of this crime he's committed that he feels was justified, and that I'm sure a lot of people might even agree is justified. It's easy to jump from an audience perspective to the conclusion that Lucien's kind of a dick because he uses the honor slaying defense, and because that defense is such bullshit in itself, because obviously you shouldn't be allowed to kill gay people just for coming on to you. That's insane. It's interesting to note that in real life, though Lucien did try to use this defense, that's not eventually what he ended up getting tried for or like charged with. The judge listened to everything that had led up to this point and understood that Lucien had been put in what he called like a psychological pressure cooker of torture by David for years, and that had culminated in this horrific act. So even like the judge agreed that the murder, although not justified, it was explainable, and Lucien was not as to blame as one would usually put on a murderer, right? I think it's really interesting that the film makes it look like they don't explicitly state that this is the case, but they kind of make it look like Lucien got away with the honor slaying defense because they don't mention any of the rest of that. And this is complete conjecture on my part, but I almost feel like that's a little bit duplicitous from the film, right? Especially because I know that the film came out in 2013, and that is the year that gay marriage became legal in the UK. And I know that it was happening in a lot of other areas around the same time, and so I have to imagine that there was a lot of discussion leading up to 2013 about gay rights and about how LGBTQ people are, you know, just as equal as the rest of us, etc., etc. People were rallying behind the LGBTQ community, and so when seeing a film like this and hearing about this false honor slaying defense, people would very easily kind of turn against Lucien in that kind of social climate. I've been giving the film a lot of grace throughout this review and talking about how it has viewed both sides with maybe a little bit of skewing just by simple fact it's told from the point of view of Alan. But I am slowly coming around to maybe thinking that the film is a little bit more sneaky and a little bit more blameful toward Lucien than I would like to admit, simply because I have a nostalgic relationship with this movie, okay, and I'm not happy about it. But I really did want to come in and say this because it was only after further pontification that I thought perhaps this film was not as unbiased as I previously thought. Lucien does get away with the crime, and we see him on the wall of a bar at the end in the newspaper clipping announcing it. It's a really heartbreaking way for the film to end, because earlier in the film Lucien said that he never wanted to end up on the wall because it was a load of people who accomplished things in like high school and college and therefore would never go on to achieve anything in life. And it's sad because we know, obviously, that it's not that he didn't go on to achieve anything in life, because apparently he was like a well-respected and liked man. He lived until like 2005. He had kids. He had wives. I think he got married like 3 times. He had a good and long life filled with great and terrible moments, okay? But he never went on to do the thing that he wanted to do, which was write poetry. He only ever got to edit other people's poetry. At the end of the film, you get a quick "Where are they now?" in the subtitles, and it says that Alan dedicated his first book of poetry to Lucien, and Lucien basically turned around and asked him to redact his name from all further editions. Which, in the framing of the film where Lucien said it was an honour slaying, is understandable because he wouldn't want anybody to be speculating about whether he was gay, because then he'd get charged with murder. But it also very much makes Lucien look like a dick. The fact that he basically cut all ties with Alan over a kiss when he could have just said, I don't even feel that way, bro. Like, let's just be friends. But then you take into account all his trauma and stuff, and obviously it's like, oh, well, he would feel that way. But the film just doesn't focus on that all that much. Like, I really was heartbroken the first time I read that, and I thought it was this tragedy that these two never got to be together. But then when you do a little bit of reading on the subject, you find out that actually this might not have been the great love story that it was presented as in this movie, which is a shame, but I do love a little bit of drama. So we're going to talk about real life now. I'm not going to rehash the murder. You can kind of look that up for yourself. It was highly publicised and it happened to a bunch of writers. So they've done it to death, I assure you. Pun not intended. I want to talk about Caleb Carr, who's Lucien Carr's real life son. And he hates this film, essentially, is the vibe that I got. He thinks that it's all based on Alan's writings and interviews and whatnot about the subject and all his fantasy about this relationship that he had with Lucien. Just in the same way that David fantasized a relationship with Lucien. He thought he was living a love story. Alan thought he was living a love story, but it just wasn't a reality. Caleb insists that Lucien, his dad, was never gay. We know that he never went on to be with any other men, so I guess that kind of backs that up. I'm not really interested in whether he was or he wasn't. I don't think it's relevant. I think that the framing of the story is important, though, because of who Lucien Carr went on to be as a person, right? So the film is framed through Alan's point of view, and we know that Alan, as somebody who was like portrayed as innocent and things, he wouldn't have understood the nuances of this kind of relationship that Lucien and David had, and therefore he only ever viewed David as a romantic rival. And even as Alan in real life grew up, his views on this unfortunately wouldn't have changed, I don't think. He wouldn't have gone on to have this understanding of how that relationship was wrong, because he went on to be a part of NAMBLA, which I only know even exists because of a South Park episode, but essentially it's an association that thinks that gay relationships between men and like underage children are like appropriate and there's nothing wrong with it. So his views on that never changed throughout his life. So obviously if they were going for Alan's point of view in this film, then that relationship wouldn't have been viewed as wrong. And obviously some of the blame for what happened will have been laid on Lucien. His denial of any kind of relationship between him and Alan, him and David, would have been seen as a betrayal. I think is tragic about Lucien as a person, not even as a character, is that everyone who was involved in this had something to say about it. Everybody got to write some poems about it or a book or whatever. He kind of never got to share his true feelings on the subject. He went on to live a comparatively quiet life to everybody else. His entire life was like dictated and narrated by other men, because even before he became an adult, David was so in control of him. He knew him from like the age of 12. Killian Darlings could be really sad for this reason. It could be another instance of a man falsely narrating Lucien's life and not just leaving the man alone. We can give a little bit of credit. As I've said before, Lucien is a mysterious character within the narrative. It's left up to debate whether or not this relationship was all in Alan's head in a way. The reason that I even wanted to watch this film in the first place was because of Saltburn, and Saltburn is viewed through Oliver's perspective, right? And that's why a lot of people like to speculate that Felix also had feelings for Oliver, but that's just because Oliver's feelings for Felix were so intense and all of the cliches were there, right, for them to be falling in love. And the same thing happens here. It's such a romantic movie that how could these two not fall prey to the cliches, bro? The comparisons between Alan and David throughout the film could be viewed in a way where Alan is also kind of preying on Lucien, who doesn't want his advances and views him as a friend in these troubling times and a confidant. But I think that that's very murky and that's a very generous interpretation based on the framing of the film, but it is there. The kiss is definitely the turning points in the film, and that's where Lucien goes cold, and he never shows any interest in Alan after that, and so you could actually view the whole thing as he only ever saw them as friends in the first place. And I think that that's good. That's a plus point. However, it can't be said that the film is totally unbiased, because in real life, Lucien at the time of the murder actually had a girlfriend, and she's nowhere to be seen. And if you read And the Hippos Were Boiled in Their Tanks, which is the book that William S. Burroughs and Jack Kerouac wrote about the murder, Alan isn't even in it. Lucien is definitely framed with some blame, because I remember at the beginning of my Saltburn review briefly commenting on Kill Your Darlings and saying I remembered that Lucien was a dick. Lucien's definitely not a dick. He's a troubled young boy who got into a horrible, horrible situation. At the end of the day, I think Kill Your Darlings as a film is about so much more than the romance and the murder. It's about war, it's about oppression, it's about sexuality, music, freedom, rebellion, okay? And I think that as a film on its own, I really still do appreciate it. And I think that as a jumping off point for finding out more about this like true crime situation and the beatlit movements, I think that that's all great. I think that the bigger issue at hand here is still for me Lucien Carr, and I try really hard here like not to romanticize him and what happened to him, okay, and like see him as this mythic figure, because he was a real man, he's a real human person, but he was also just this obscure figure, this person that everybody's written about but who has no voice for himself, okay? And you can only kind of speculate, you can only project onto him. He was the muse and the inspiration for such great works, the catalyst for this movement in a way, and we'll never get to know what the real situation was, and that frustrates and entices me so much. It's like he's the Mona Lisa of beat literature, okay? And we will just never know what is behind that man's smile.